For decades, Tom Celich was the picture of control. He chose his roles carefully, guarded his private life fiercely, and walked away from opportunities most actors would have chased without hesitation. But lately, the silence around his name has felt different. When someone who spent his life avoiding stillness suddenly stops moving, it raises questions few people are willing to ask. This is not the story people think they know about Tom Celich, the man who never planned to stop. He never believed in slowing down. Even as others spoke about retirement, legacy, or stepping away gracefully, he rejected those ideas outright. For him, work was never just ambition. It was structure, proof that he still mattered, and the thing that kept everything else from falling apart. That mindset didn't come from fame, but from instability. Long before he became recognizable, Tom grew up in an environment shaped by uncertainty. His father moved the family across the country for a commission-only job with no safety net. There were years when money was tight, when nothing was guaranteed, and when failure felt dangerously close. That fear never disappeared, it simply evolved. As he got older, Tom didn't pursue acting out of passion. He studied business, worked retail jobs, and chose community college so he could live at home and save money. Even when opportunities in entertainment came his way, he always kept a backup plan. When work dried up, he didn't panic. He quietly returned to whatever job he could find. Over time, that habit became part of his identity. Success didn't soften him. It reinforced his belief that stopping was dangerous. When his career finally stabilized, he gravitated toward long-running commitments that offered routine and predictability. He wasn't interested in chasing headlines or jumping from role to role. He wanted something that anchored his life, and that instinct stayed with him for decades, right up to his final major television role. So when that long-running series ended, it wasn't just the loss of a show. It was the loss of the structure that held everything together. People close to him noticed the shift immediately. Without scripts, call times, and daily responsibilities, he became restless. Friends described him as irritable, while others said he seemed bored, bitter, and unsettled. It wasn't just that the show ended. It was that it ended without his control. He tried to keep moving, reaching out to old connections and refusing to accept it as closure. But underneath that determination was a quieter fear, that if he stopped, there would be nothing left to hold on to. At the same time, his body began to push back. For most of his life, Tom trusted his physical presence, his height, posture, and endurance to carry him forward. Even as he aged, he believed discipline would be enough. But the cracks appeared slowly. Difficulty getting out of a chair, lingering pain, a limp that refused to fade. At first, he ignored it, treating it like any other discomfort he had pushed through before. But this time was different. By the end of his final television run, the strain had become impossible to hide. He struggled to walk without assistance. Physical therapy became part of his routine, but progress was slow. Surgeries on both knees left visible scars, and even after recovery, he remained unsteady. Simple movements required effort, and balance could no longer be taken for granted. His weight added further strain. At over 6 feet tall and nearing 350 pounds, the pressure on his joints intensified. Doctors warned him that the damage was accelerating, but every step became a negotiation between pride and pain. What troubled him most wasn't just the discomfort, it was the loss of independence. He had always been self-sufficient, and the idea of needing help, even something as simple as a walker, was difficult to accept. As his mobility declined, his mood darkened. He became more withdrawn, more impatient, and less willing to engage. With his show gone and his body limiting him, he felt trapped in a way he had never experienced before. That sense of isolation became especially visible on his 80th birthday. There were no celebrations, no public appearances, no gatherings of friends. Instead, he was seen alone, sitting in his truck in a parking lot near his home in Thousand Oaks, eating fast food. For someone who had spent a lifetime moving forward, the image was striking. He had already said he no longer celebrated birthdays, preferring not to measure time that way, but the reality of that moment felt heavier. It wasn't just privacy, it was loneliness. By then, his routine had disappeared, and the calls that once filled his days had grown quiet. He reached out to old colleagues and co-stars, not out of desperation, but out of fear of being forgotten. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing relevance, something that felt increasingly fragile with age. The silence hurt most. Hollywood doesn't always reject people loudly. It moves on quietly. One day you're central, and the next you're optional. That birthday meal wasn't about food. It was about absence. The absence of purpose, routine, and the noise that once distracted him from deeper fears. Those fears only grew when he looked at the place he once considered his refuge, his ranch. For years, it had been his escape, a place where he could work the land and feel grounded. But over time, it became a source of stress. Drought hit the property hard, killing trees and draining resources. In an attempt to keep it alive, he made decisions that led to legal trouble and public backlash. Though the case was resolved, the damage lingered. The ranch itself stopped being sustainable. His avocado business failed, maintenance costs soared, and the land that once thrived began to wither. At the same time, his steady acting income disappeared. He admitted publicly that he wasn't sure he could afford to keep the property without work, a statement that surprised many who assumed decades of success meant financial security. But Tom had never lived like someone preparing to stop. He lived as if the next job was always necessary. That fear became more evident when he offered to take a pay cut just to keep his show alive. It wasn't strategy, it was a plea to maintain stability. His personal life carried its own weight. While he kept it largely private, his marriages were shaped by the same pressures that defined his career. His first marriage ended under strain, and questions lingered long after. His second marriage began in secrecy, an attempt to protect something from public scrutiny. Even then, stability required effort. Long work schedules and constant pressure nearly broke the relationship early on, and counseling became essential. Fatherhood brought both joy and guilt, especially as his family lived in isolation on the ranch. What he saw as safety sometimes felt like loneliness to those around him. There were deeper struggles he rarely discussed publicly, including his adopted son's battle with addiction. Rehab, financial trouble, and relapses created ongoing stress that spilled into every part of his life. Through it all, Tom kept working, not as an escape, but as a way to avoid confronting everything at once. As his health declined and work slowed, those unresolved pressures became harder to ignore. Without distraction, reflection took over. Eventually, he reached a point where working harder no longer fixed anything. His body resisted, his schedule emptied, and the silence he had avoided for so long finally settled in. In his memoir, he admitted what many didn't expect. He was struggling. The pain was constant, mobility loss was frightening, and retirement didn't feel like rest, it felt like erasure. He spoke openly about depression, describing long, unstructured days and the toll of physical limitations. Even after decades of success, he didn't feel secure enough to stop. The ranch still demanded more than he could give, and the loss of his show hit harder than he anticipated. Walking became increasingly difficult, and while therapy helped, progress was slow. Friends noticed he seemed worn down, not defeated, but exhausted in a way that rest couldn't fix. Still, he didn't completely withdraw. He explored writing, reflected on his life, and tried to redefine his sense of purpose. But for someone who had spent a lifetime equating worth with productivity, letting go felt like failure. As discussions about potential future projects surfaced, he hoped to stay involved in some capacity, not as the center of attention, but as someone still useful. Whether that happens remains uncertain. Health may ultimately decide for him. Tom Celich spent his life staying busy to avoid standing still, and now that everything has slowed, the real question isn't just about his success, but about what it cost him. For someone like him, stepping away from work may not bring peace. It may simply make the silence louder.